But our guest tonight is Dr. DIMITRI SIMES. He's going to be talking on the Russian transformation, implications for the United States. I know a lot of you have read things which have been written by Dr. SIMES. He's quoted widely, he's written widely, and he's highly respected. His MA is from the Moscow State University. His PhD equivalent, Soviet equivalent, was from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, the USSR Academy of Sciences, in 1972. He was at the Georgetown University with their Center for Strategic and International Studies from 1973 to 1980, serving as the Director of Soviet Studies after having first been Senior Research Fellow. He was then at the Johns Hopkins Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. He was Director of the Soviet and East European Research Program and Research Professor of Soviet Studies, 1980 to 83, and Professorial Lecturer from 83 to 90. He was an Adjunct Professor of Political Science at Columbia in 92, and he has been with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, most recently as Senior Associate. He's been consultant to a wide number of major news organizations. He's the author of the books Détente and Conflict, Soviet Foreign Policy, 1972 to 77, and editor and co-author of Soviet Succession, Leadership in Transition, as well as articles in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and other leading journals. On November the 1st, he will begin his new job as president of the Nixon Center in California. That center is associated with the Nixon Library. It is, its mission is to study issues of national security, domestic and foreign. The chairman of its advisory council is Henry Kissinger. It's a bipartisan organization. Robert Strauss is a member of their board of directors. Their largest grant has been from the Annenberg Foundation recently, $5 million. Its supporters are optimistic that it will play a major role in the discussion of national security interests in a post-Cold War era. As I said, our topic tonight is the Russian transformation. We have as our guest the very distinguished Dr. DIMITRI SIMES. It's my great pleasure to welcome him. Dr. SIMES.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bert. It was a very kind introduction. Oh, one minor correction. The Nixon Center, in addition to their offices in California, will have an office in Washington as of November 1st with a huge portrait of Richard Nixon. That is not the only reason the center is being established. You mentioned that I contributed to and edited a little book on Soviet succession back in 1978 under the State Department grant. And I am grateful that you reminded me of this book, because that book demonstrates, in my view, very well how difficult it is to make predictions about something that is going on right now in front of us. I made two confident predictions in my chapter in that book. One prediction was considered absolutely crazy, and another prediction was considered reasonable and sober. The crazy prediction was that as soon as Brezhnev dies, that there would be a major change in the Soviet Union, that there would be new, young, dynamic leadership, which would liberalize the country and would proceed with profound institutional reforms, and that there would be new foreign policy, much less ideological, much less anti-Western. That suggestion was considered crazy and irresponsible. Then there was a second proposition, that liberalization would not go very far. That whoever would be in power in the Soviet Union would have to come from the system, would have to be a party apparatchik, that whatever dreams he would have about building civilized, normal, market-oriented society in his country, that he would have to stop somewhere once they understand fundamentals of the system. That if you try to liberalize a prison, it's very unlikely that your inmates, after granted their freedom, would say, "Thank you very much, Mr. Warden, and now we are going to stay here voluntarily and enthusiastically." It was the fate of Russian reform in the past, not only under the Bolsheviks, but long before under the Tsars, that whenever they would try reforms, some people are very ungrateful to reformers. They would say, "Well, thank you very much, but we interpret our freedom differently. We, the Poles, now want to have our own state. We, the Finns, under the Tsars, don't want to live under the Moscow rule. And most important, we, the Ukrainians, we have our own aspirations." And the Tsars, of course, always would proceed with the crackdown, and that would slow down and eventually kill Russian reforms. My assumption was, and frankly an assumption of every other Sovietologist in this country, in Europe, and of most Russian specialists at that time, was that the same fate would bound to take place when a new Russian communist reformer would try to change the system. So what happened? Why were we so wrong? Well, we were wrong because we did not predict that it was possible to have a highly disciplined party apparatchik like Mikhail Gorbachev, a great tactician who knew how to outmaneuver his colleagues, who rose through the ranks, who was a part and parcel of the system, and who did not understand the damn thing about his own country and about his own party. I had a very interesting conversation with Yegor Ligachev, who was Gorbachev's conservative counterpart in the Politburo. And Ligachev came to the United States. There was a dinner for him at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. And I was able to ask him a couple of questions. And I said, "You gave a very persuasive presentation about what Gorbachev was doing to your party and your country." I said, "A lot of us, of course, are very happy that Gorbachev succeeded. But in a way, you were right, that consequences of his reforms were bound to be devastating to your party and to your empire. Why didn't you stop him when you had the majority?" And he said, "Well, first of all, we were not brought up to argue too much with the General Secretary." But second, he said, "See, he always told me, he always told other Politburo members that he really was one of us, that he wanted to improve communism, that our concerns about not going too far were his concerns. But just as the General Secretary, he had a somewhat different perspective, a greater responsibility, but that he, under no circumstances, would go overboard." I could later discuss this with Mr. Gorbachev himself, and he completely supported Mr. Ligachev's account. And the most interesting thing is that Gorbachev apparently sincerely believed that he was just improving the system, that he was just building better communism. He did not understand that you could not make that empire free, that by definition, freedom meant the end of his empire. And he was engaged in a delicate balancing act till the end of his days in power. And he was overthrown, and he still does not understand today what happened to him. Yesterday he spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and he still was talking about some colleagues who betrayed him, about some intriguers, about President Bush abandoning him and allowing his government to collapse. He did not understand that his mission was mission impossible. The reason for this introduction is obvious. We are dealing with a very complex, difficult transition in Russia today, with many contrasting forces, with a great variety of highly diverse voices, with many ambitious players, people with their own agendas. Anyone who knows for sure what is going to be the outcome of this transformation is a very courageous person. I am not that courageous. That is why I will start my presentation with a question, and I will end my presentation with a question about the basic direction and about the fate of this Russian historic transformation. And essentially, there are two different interpretations of what is happening in Russia today. Both of these interpretations are equally legitimate, and both of them may be supported by considerable evidence. Yet, only one of these interpretations will be historically correct, justified by history. I was with my wife in Moscow in June, and it was a very interesting experience. She came there about 2 weeks before me, and I arrived to the World Economic Forum. And she had an opportunity to talk to a lot of young people, intellectuals, professionals, entrepreneurs. And she had, I think, a very encouraging experience and felt that things were beginning to change for the better. And as she was passing through the lobby, I was talking to one of the regional architects of Glasnost, distinguished Russian economist Nikolai Shmylov, who was telling me that things were going down the drain, that Russia was becoming a country run by the mafiosos and was on the road to a new authoritarian dictatorship and an aggressive and neo-imperial foreign policy. And as our conversation evolved, it became clear that there was no disagreement about facts. It was a different emotional response to different sets of facts, a different emotional response which reflected difference in age and in situation. And maybe you know, as it often happens in Russia, just how you feel at a particular moment, this particular evening. There is a question. What are we witnessing today in Russia? If you talk to the Clinton administration, they have a clear-cut party line. What you see today in Russia is a great historic transition to democracy and a benign foreign policy. Now, these are very knowledgeable people. Somebody like Strop Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State, of course, is a long-term student of Russian affairs, knows personally all Russian political leaders very well, long before they became Russian political leaders, knows ordinary people, was kayaking in Siberia, knows a lot about Russia and has a lot of friends there. But while they do understand complexity of the Russian situation, they have a very optimistic interpretation of this complexity. They would say zigzags are inevitable. After all, they only yesterday were a communist totalitarian empire. Everything is broken. New arrangements, new rules are only being created. It is historically inevitable that there would be difficulties, obstacles, zigzags, reverses, disappointments. But if you would look at the general direction of events inside Russia and changes in the Russian foreign policy, you can say, to use President Clinton's expression, we are moving to a stable and permanent partnership with Russia. Stable and permanent partnership. Nothing short of that. There is a different interpretation that what we have witnessed in Russia during the last 3 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union was a beautiful democratic interlude. That the old regime, old system of control, all machinery of oppression, they were destroyed. New one was not yet created. That they have destroyed their own empire. They had no strong army. Their economic resources were extremely limited. They needed helping hand from the West. So accordingly, they had to be at their best behavior in international affairs. Well, you know, even Stalin on several occasions was at his best behavior with the West when he needed Western investment and know-how. We have seen all that. There was a benign interlude in Peter the Great's foreign policy when he needed Western know-how and wanted to bring Russia into Europe. But in the past, every time Russia would recover from its period of difficulties, would be on its feet once again, new nomenclatura, new oligarchy would be established, new oppressive procedures would be developed, and with new strengths, financed by Western money and technology, with these new strengths, they would be back at their assertive imperial conduct. That is, of course, the interpretation of Henry Kissinger. Richard Nixon, I think, had changed his views on the nature of Russian transition during last 3-4 years of his life. I think the way he started, he was closer to the Clinton administration. Of course, there was no Clinton administration at that time, but I think that Nixon felt that what was happening in Russia was so momentous that we were not in a position to ask too many questions and decide to act only when there would be no ambiguity. His concern was that if you wait till everything is clear and settled, then it may be too late to make a difference. And of course, we had two very serious concerns about Russia at that time. One concern was that disintegration of the Soviet Union would lead to disintegration of Russia, to civil war. In a country with 35,000–40,000 of nuclear weapons, with nuclear and chemical weapon depots, with very poorly designed nuclear reactors, and with an enormous potential for Chernobyl multiplied many times over. And that is even if you don't think that in civil wars people sometimes begin throwing at each other most crazy things, including battlefield nukes. So one great concern was that unless we try to help the Russians to do something about their situation, that the whole post-Soviet region would go down the drain with most devastating consequences, not only for the Russians, not only for the world, but I would say for the future of the mankind. The second concern which we had at that time was that very unsavory people could come to power in Russia. That the alternative to Boris Yeltsin, with all his imperfections, could be absolutely horrifying. One alternative, we thought, was the communist nomenclatura. Those people who tried to take over Russia, the Soviet Union, back in August 1991. And they were very unprofessional. Their conduct was very clumsy. But you know, it was a close call, if you think about that. And for any American statesman not to consider a possibility of communist imperial comeback would be irresponsible. That was President Nixon's thinking. But then, gradually, as the Russian transition was gaining speed, a new danger emerged. The danger of populist extremists, of people like Zhirinovsky, of neo-fascist Russian style, people who would be damaged by Russian transition, damaged psychologically in terms of their sense of identity, of course damaged economically. And let's face it, with 26 million Russians finding themselves outside Russian borders, suddenly becoming foreigners, you have to think about it. Every Russian family now had somebody living abroad and very often complaining about being discriminated against, about every Russian family. And of course, that would give much greater legitimacy to nationalist movements, to all kinds of demagogues. In comparison with Zhirinovsky and company, Boris Yeltsin looked like a knight in shining armor. That is why President Nixon and a number of others who agreed with him felt very strongly that whatever misgivings we had about Boris Yeltsin, about the nature of Russian transition, the alternative to helping Russian democratic experiment was far worse. And that is why at first the Bush administration and then the Clinton administration decided to bet on Yeltsin, decided to bet on Russian democracy. I think it was the right decision. But I don't have to tell you that in politics, including in international politics, timing is everything. What was absolutely correct and perfectly wise yesterday may be an unsound policy today and a disastrous policy tomorrow. When you are witnessing a momentous historic transition like the one we are witnessing in Russia, where stakes are so enormous, not only for Russia, but for the United States as well, we would be derelict of our duty as informed citizens if we based our current assumptions about Russia on our hopes and affections of yesterday. We have to remember that Russia is a living organism. And today, things are moving so fast that every 3 months, sometimes 1 month, is changing the situation very considerably. President Nixon went to Russia 4 times during the last 3 years of his life. And I am not here to try to contribute to rehabilitation of President Nixon. Among other things, most people made their minds about him long ago. And I think that it just is a pointless exercise to try to debate his virtues or lack of them. But what is important for you to understand that the reason President Nixon went to Russia 4 times during 3 years, at a fairly mature age, between 78 and 81, was because he could see how unstable and quickly changing the Russian situation was. And he felt that it was his duty, since he decided to talk about these issues and try to have an impact, to monitor them on a regular basis, to talk to the same people over a period of time, to see how they evolved, how their views progressed. And when he came from Moscow last time, he wrote a memo to President Clinton, which President Clinton very generously described as the best position paper on Russia he has ever read. President Nixon wrote a piece, op-ed piece, which appeared in the New York Times, where he said, "We have accomplished a great deal in Russia. The Yeltsin government is much more stable. The market economy is gaining speed, and these people are not becoming neo-imperial, and reconquering the former Soviet territory is not on their agenda anytime soon. And they are definitely not interested in a global confrontation with the West and have no resources for that." But at the same time, President Nixon said there are new authoritarian trends in Russia, including in the Yeltsin entourage. There is a new climate of fear, a new sense that the Tsar knows it all, a new imperial court, Yeltsin's entourage, which sometimes is more important than the official government itself. That the new State Duma, fortunately, has a much more harmonious relationship with Yeltsin than the old neo-communist Supreme Soviet. But one part of this harmonious relationship is that that Duma doesn't matter very much, that essentially it is an advisory body. And President Nixon began raising a very important question. What is more important for the United States in relations with Russia at this stage of Russian transition? To see President Yeltsin personally to succeed and stay in power, or to see checks and balances in Russia? What is more important for us? To see that they would have a very logical and well-organized market economic reform, or that they would have a benign foreign policy? You like to think that you can have all these things at once, all together. That would be absolutely marvelous. But these are not real choices we are facing today in Russia. For instance, when President Yeltsin came to Washington last time, he was at his best behavior, you know, between his escapades in Berlin, where he, according to the Deutsche Zeitung, was permanently under the influence, and interestingly enough, was usually more drunk in the morning than in the evening. And then, as you know, President Yeltsin was undisposed to see the Prime Minister of Ireland, who not only went to meet him at the Shannon airport, but there was supposed to be an official state dinner. You understand, the trip was not billed as President Yeltsin's visit to the United States. It was supposed to be President Yeltsin's official visit to Great Britain, the United States, and Ireland. And the President of Russia was undisposed to leave his plane and to talk to the Irish Prime Minister and to attend the state dinner. But while President Yeltsin was in Washington, by all accounts, he was at his best behavior. He was perfectly sober. He was forceful. He was well informed. Had a good sense of humor. But among the things he apparently told the congressional leadership, they asked him a question. Senator Dole asked him a question. Mr. President, he said, I understand that some of your advisors are suggesting that presidential elections, which are scheduled for June 1996, that these elections may be postponed or cancelled altogether. And Yeltsin said, that's not true, because there are people who want to postpone parliamentary elections. And he said, I expressed my opinion that we have to look into that, and if the Federal Assembly works constructively, meaning to President Yeltsin's liking. That then President Yeltsin said, I may consider giving them another 2 years. For you to understand, it would be totally unconstitutional. The Constitution was drafted by Yeltsin and his people, was officially adopted only last December. But President Yeltsin told the American congressional leadership that if his parliament behaves constructively, he may keep them for another 2 years. But he said, as far as presidential elections are concerned, he said, I can assure you we are going to have them. That is very encouraging. There is one little problem. And President Dole reminded President Yeltsin about that. He said, but Mr. President, only 2.5 years ago, you said that you would never even run second time. You said that you decided to be a one-term president. And Yeltsin said, well, it was under different circumstances. I don't think that President Yeltsin was entirely truthful. I was in his office with President Nixon just a month after President Yeltsin announced that he was never going to run again. And during that meeting, President Yeltsin made abundantly clear that there was nothing more than a tactical maneuver. He just wanted to be sure that he can proceed with a drastic, radical, painful economic reform, and people do understand that he is willing to sacrifice himself, that he would go full speed, and is not bound to be responsive to all kinds of political influences, which a politician who wants to be re-elected again would have to take into account. I am concerned that President Yeltsin will not want to stand a re-election, because if you look at his level of popularity in Russia, it may be a trying experience for him. Only 19% of all people who were questioned by, interestingly enough, the official Center on Public Opinion, which is a part of Yeltsin's presidential administration, only 19% of the people said that they trust President Yeltsin. 57% said that they did not trust him. Now, does it mean that he would not be re-elected? Absolutely not. because the Russians are very cynical today, and they don't trust most of their politicians. And unless you know who Mr. Yeltsin would be running against, and what would be the state of Russian economy in June 1996, unless you know that, you cannot say that President Yeltsin's days are over. But you do understand that if your popularity is 19%, you got a problem. You also have to appreciate something else. It is true that President Yeltsin is the first democratically elected president in the Russian history. But there is something else involved in his situation. There was never before a peaceful democratic transition from one leader to another in Russia and the Soviet Union. People always were removed, overthrown, or died on the job. Would President Yeltsin just be the first democratically elected president, or would he establish another precedent, an orderly, peaceful, constitutional transfer of power? That is very, very important. President Yeltsin, to the best of my knowledge, is not personally on the take. He has a lot of critics in Russia. I never had anyone suggesting that the president of Russia is on the take, has a Swiss account, or is personally corrupt. I'm sure if there was any evidence to that effect, we would know about that. But we all know how widespread is corruption in Russia. We do know that the cancer of corruption has reached the heart of the Russian presidency. We do know, for instance, that the person whom Yeltsin, despite a categorical no from the parliament, just appointed the Attorney General, despite the parliament saying no, that person himself was accused of having a Swiss bank account, being engaged in great corruption, dealing with international black marketeers and drug traders. We do know that the chairman of the upper house of the Federal Assembly has an office in Washington of his industrial association. His son-in-law is the director of that office. And we do know that American officials were somewhat shocked by the conduct of this Russian speaker's party when they were in the United States 2 months ago, and they were literally on a shopping spree, going to Disney, lobbying American corporations to give them private gifts, and they really got so much stuff they hardly could put it on their plane. We do know that Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Mr. Oleg Lobov, Yeltsin's old friend and confidant, that he is honorary chairman of another industrial association. They have a huge building in Moscow. Corporations are a part of this association. And Mr. Lobov, as Secretary of the Security Council, decides which of these Russian corporations have to pay taxes, which of them are non-profit. Believe me or not, there is such a concept as a non-profit corporation in Russia these days. And some of these corporations are even allowed to take Russian oil and natural gas and to sell it abroad without paying any taxes, any customs, and practically for nothing. Does President Yeltsin know about all that? Well, a Russian mafioso was killed several months ago, a Russian mafioso of Georgian descent. There were different stories about who and why killed him. One story was that he was killed by the Moscow police because he was very much involved and had good relations with the Russian Federal Counterintelligence Service, but had very bad relationship with the Moscow police and was accusing them of corruption. Anyway, he was killed, and that became a national scandal. And one revelation as a part of the scandal was that President Yeltsin gave this gangster a special license to export oil without paying any fees. There is a man called Shamil Terpishev, who is now Yeltsin's closest friend and confidant. He is Yeltsin's tennis coach. Now, incidentally, when I'm saying that he is Yeltsin's friend and confidant, it's not my observation. That's in Yeltsin's recent book, Yeltsin's Memoirs, where Yeltsin says that he has 2 real, reliable, loyal friends whose company he truly enjoys. The chief of his security, the chief of his Praetorian Guard, Lieutenant General Mikhail Korzhakov, and that man, tennis coach Shamil Terpishchev. Shamil Terpishchev was also granted by Yeltsin's special decree the right to sell oil and gold anywhere abroad without any customs and without any taxes. Now, if that is the case, and I happen to believe that this is the case because President Yeltsin never disputed that these decrees were signed by him. If that is the case, can you imagine how the Yeltsin entourage should dislike the notion of elections if there is any chance that they may lose? You are not just talking about a bunch of American politicians leaving office and going to corporations and universities. You are talking about the upper strata of Russian nomenclature probably going to prison. That's what is at stake. And you can imagine how personally embarrassed President Yeltsin can be. The temptation in Moscow to create a semi-authoritarian regime with minimal constitutional guarantees is very, very strong. We have to decide how do we feel about this temptation. To what extent it is a concern to us. We don't want to destabilize the Russian government. We don't want to alienate President Yeltsin. He is a duly elected head of another great power. But at the same time, if we have any guarantee that Russia would be a normal, non-aggressive country, the checks and the balances, some kind of constitutional predictability is the only serious hope we got. That is a serious dilemma facing the American government. In terms of Russian foreign policy, again we got a problem. Our Russian friends are telling us that we have to be sensitive to their domestic requirements, that if President Yeltsin does not take a strong nationalist stand, particularly in the so-called New Abroad, then he would surrender high patriotic ground to very dangerous people. People like Zhirinovsky, people like former Vice President Rudskoy, people like a new emerging Russian strongman General Lebedь. And accordingly we are told that we have to understand that when Russian Foreign Minister Kozyrev is talking about new Russian global role and is saying that Russia is entitled to police the New Abroad, we should not take it too literally. And if we push President Yeltsin on these issues too hard, he would have two choices: to have a confrontation with us, which nobody wants and needs, or he would become very vulnerable domestically. This is a serious problem. My trouble with this kind of an argument is that it's not just that the Russians are engaged in peacekeeping. They create the need for peacekeeping. What I mean, at first their troops destabilize the situation, and then we are told that there is a need for them to come and police. And I have to ask you a broader philosophical question. How would you feel if in 1948 the Japanese said that they need to police Southeast Asia because it was in their sphere of influence 3 years after World War II? How would you feel if the Germans in 1948 said that they wanted to police their neighborhood in Central Europe and beyond? Try to think about that. These are Russian troops on the former Soviet territory, outside Russian borders, which only yesterday were Soviet troops. They are wearing same uniforms, different epaulets, but same uniforms. They are commanded very often by same officers. And now we are asking local people to believe that they are innocent, altruistic peacekeepers. We got a real problem. I don't want to simplify. We need President Yeltsin to stay on the job. And we do need Russia as a partner. Among other things, it would be very difficult for us to proceed with the current deterrent action against Kuwait if Russia went beyond rhetoric at the United Nations and really tried to block it. We do need a good relationship with Russia. And there are indeed many politicians and movements and trends in Russia which are much more dangerous than President Yeltsin. But at the same time, you are witnessing a newly assertive Russian foreign policy conduct. You witness an emergence of new authoritarian structures. And you also witness the new Russian elite, which operates inside their own country under conditions of what they call bespredel, without limits, without rules. People who feel completely free to disregard any legal or constitutional procedures. Let me ask you, if you know that the rulers of a particular country feel that they can do almost whatever at home, would you have much confidence that if and when they become stronger, that they would behave differently in a benign fashion abroad? That is a big and difficult question. The good news, Russia today is not interested in any ideological crusades. The good news, people who rule Russia are pragmatic people, and they are not interested in any adventures. They would not even send their troops to reconquer Chechnya in the northern Caucasus, which is a part of Russia. So most certainly they are not planning to march to the Indian Ocean. Good news, they want to be a part of the world economy. They want to be rich. They want to be accepted. They want to be a part of new information revolution. These are not crazy and irresponsible people. I think that what Margaret Thatcher said years ago about Gorbachev can be fully applied to Boris Yeltsin. We can do business with him and with his people. But I want to end exactly where I started, with a question. Do we know for sure what we are witnessing today in Russia? We know how it started. We don't know how it is going to end. And we will have to make very important and very difficult judges. Would we tend to err on the side of skepticism and caution, or optimism and hope? And there is a price to pay for moving in either direction. And to find the right balance will require a great deal of wisdom and statesmanship, and if you wish, patience and propensity for living with ambiguity. And let me stop. Thank you. Russia and Ukraine are divided today by the same fundamental policy preference. Ukraine does not want to join Russia. Russia does not want to take Ukraine. It's very simple. As difficult as is the situation in the Russian economy, it's almost an economic miracle in comparison with what is happening in Ukraine. And I tried to tell you that the Russian population and Russian politicians today are in a very selfish mood. To accept responsibility for 50 million Ukrainians, to provide them with subsidies, to help them to stabilize their currency, there is no interest in that whatsoever. And there is also little attachment to the Crimea, and particularly to this aging Black Sea fleet, which is really of symbolic significance not only to Ukraine, but also to Russia, but of little else. President Leonid Kuchma is a very impressive man. I have to say I'm much more impressed with him than with his predecessor Leonid Kravchuk, because he never was a party ideologue, never fought, in contrast to Kravchuk, Ukrainian nationalists. He doesn't have to go overboard to prove his Ukrainian nationalist credentials. He does understand that for Ukrainian economy to be solvent, they need a modicum of cooperation with Russia. It's as simple as that. He understands that Ukraine is not going to be conquered by Russia as long as Ukraine manages to maintain a minimal level of economic stability. But you cannot maintain a minimal level of economic stability if you don't have a modicum of cooperation with Russia. He is a much more responsible Ukrainian patriot, in my view, than President Kravchuk. I have to say, however, that what I was talking about with such level of optimism is about current circumstances. If you look into the future, there is a very serious problem. Ukraine is a very artificial creation. Make no mistake about that. There never was a Ukrainian state except between 1918 and 1920 during the Civil War. They have less tradition of statehood than Confederacy in the United States. This is a huge region with very different populations and traditions. To show you how different they are, I would just mention that Western Ukraine, till really 1939, was never a part of the Russian Empire. It belonged to Austro-Hungary. They have different religion, Catholicism. They use different alphabet. Everything there was different. For these people to go to Russia, I mean, it's an alien experience. If you go to an area like Zaporozhye, Donbass, this is a Russian area. It's a totally Russian, Russified. They don't want to be ruled from Moscow, far away, that huge country which never was particularly nice and kind to them, but they don't want to burn their bridges to Russia. They are willing to stay in Ukraine as long as they can have their cake and eat it too. Meaning they can be Ukrainians, but enjoy all benefits of intimate connections with Russia. I mean, these people are willing to live in Ukraine if Ukraine is like Canada to the United States.
So trade, basically, economy and trade.
Open borders, full freedom of movement, and etc. Whether President Kuchma will be able to find the right balance between these different regions is an open question, particularly if you take into account that he has a rather assertive and very conservative neo-communist parliament. You also have to take into account that, as I again tried to argue, while Russian politicians today are not interested in any aggression against their neighbors, they also feel rather strongly that in the long run there would have to be a much greater integration on the former Soviet territory, and that Russia clearly would have to become the first among the equals. At a certain point, those aspirations may clash with Ukrainian independence. If you are talking about aid, one needs to be very specific. If we decided to put an end to rescheduling Russian debt, that would be the end of the Russian economy very quickly. They need a preferential treatment from the World Bank, MFN, Club of Paris, in order to stay solvent. That is still very important. If you are talking about humanitarian assistance, if you are talking about direct grants to all kinds of Russian economic and humanitarian programs, social programs, I think we should put an end to this as quickly as possible, because this money is being wasted. Russian people don't see this money. Most of this money is being either stolen or being paid to foreign consultants, and it creates a very unhappy situation. A lot of people here, including a lot of members of Congress, they look at the American contribution and they almost think that we are a donor nation. Russia is a recipient nation, and that they should behave with deference and gratitude to the United States. Most Russian politicians are saying that the West promised much, delivered little, and demands more and more and more. That situation of dependence, I think, is becoming a factor of friction rather than a constructive influence in the Russian-American relationship. As far as the investor climate is concerned, well, again, you're coming to the same fundamental point we were discussing. What is important for us in terms of the Russian political system? President Yeltsin has a simple answer. He is the greatest champion of foreign investment. Help him to consolidate power in Russia, and he would become probably as good to foreign investors as Pinochet was in Chile. If on occasion they would limit some of their domestic freedoms, I don't remember it particularly deterring any foreign investors in Chile, let's face it. The other, of course, point of view, which I personally happen to share, is that as long as they have this capriciousness in the Russian political system, when laws can be ignored, when taxes can be applied retroactively, when, like in Nigeria, you cannot function without paying a bribe, that it puts very considerable limits to foreign investment. When Ambassador Pickering, who is actually speaking right today at the Nixon Center in California, when Ambassador Pickering addressed the US-Russian Business Council session in Moscow last week, he said that for an American company to start operations in Russia, they usually have to get as many as 90 different signatures. What Ambassador Pickering did not mention, but I'm confident he would not disagree with what I'm going to say, none of these signatures come without a bribe. I do not mean to imply that all American businesses in Russia pay bribes. I mean, they don't pay directly. For that, you have Russian partners in joint venture. For that, you have intermediaries. For that, you have consultants. There is a great power of denial. But you know, a number of businessmen, I just talked to somebody who is a very important American chief executive officer of major multinational corporation, was for years, decades, one of the champions of investment in the Soviet Union in Russia, knew every Soviet and Russian leader since Khrushchev. And he said that enough is enough, and he is going to put his operations in Russia on hold, because that, he says, is becoming impossible. This pressure to pay more and more and more, and you feel that you contribute to Russia, that you help them to build infrastructure, that you are a good citizen, but nobody is asking what you can do for my country. The only question is what you can do for me, now, in hard currency. And you know, some foreign corporations will adjust to that, not all. This is a question about the Russian space program. I am not a scientist, I am not an engineer, I am not even a space buff. My experience with space usually comes from American movies. My feeling is that the Russian space program is in shambles like everything else, that they are cooperating with a variety of American companies, with Lockheed, with Boeing. They are cooperating with the French. There are a number of things that can be done jointly, usefully, and effectively, but that could not become a pillar of the Russian-American relationship. What you do, of course, is you help people to create circumstances when they can be in charge of their own destiny. How? You started with free market. You started with free market. You start by allowing people to own their own businesses. You start with allowing people to have free media, which does exist in Russia today. You start by allowing people to express their opinions. You start by allowing people to pursue their professions and to be promoted on the basis of their drive and qualifications, not on the basis of their loyalty to the party. And you just hope against hope that that new sense of self-sufficiency, of being the master of your own fate, that this will have a spillover impact from the economic sphere, from professional sphere to political life. But even if you are an optimist, I think you have to expect that this is going to be a difficult and long process. And I think my answer to this question goes to the core of my not so sanguine attitude to President Yeltsin. I happen to think that we can afford to be less than totally sanguine when we talk about Yeltsin. I think that people like Zhirinovsky don't stand a chance in Russia. I think that Russia is not Weimar Germany. There is a modest economic revival rather than economic collapse. As much as they complain about foreigners, it is not like they were occupied by foreign powers. There is no sense that they were victimized by foreigners, the way Germany felt victimized after World War I. I think the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, President Nixon were absolutely right in suggesting that we should offer Russia a helping hand. If for no other reason, to eliminate a possibility that we become a scapegoat in Russian domestic battles. That mission is mission accomplished. I have seen Mr. Zhirinovsky twice. He is not a strong man. He is not a man of conviction. He is a lightweight demagogue of Jewish origin who pretends to be anti-Semitic for opportunistic reasons. He's surrounded by other people. Actually, all three leaders of his neo-fascist party are people of some Jewish ancestry. And in all seriousness, Ms. Zhirinovsky told President Nixon, in my presence, President Nixon should come back and talk to the leaders of the American Jewish community and explain that Zhirinovsky should be supported by the American Jews. Because he said, look at the surnames of our leaders. Don't you understand the origin, Zhirinovsky said. And the real, much more dangerous fascists. And we are a barrier to their success in Russia. There were, through Russian history, people who were called holy people, clowns, people who manifested their opposition to the regime by trying to look as, how to put it, somewhat serious, somewhat clownish. These people sometimes were respected, sometimes supported. They never came to power. If you are talking about the Russian communists, they cannot come to power alone without a very serious transformation of the Russian Communist Party. I am very impressed with the Russian communist leader, Gennady Zyuganov. He is a smart man, he is a serious man, and while he is attached to the past, he is not addicted to it. And he can understand that he now lives in a different country, that the bridges were burned long ago. Mr. Zyuganov's problem, however, is that in contrast to neo-communists, former communists in Central Europe or in the Baltics, he has 6 other communist parties, all of them more radical and extremist than his. And he has a dilemma. To have a chance in Russia, he needs to be more social democratic. But to be relevant today, he needs to keep his base. He is afraid that his party cells, which give him a disproportionate influence in Russia, far beyond the numbers of his followers, that these cells can go to more extreme organizations, and also with secret money and other resources. General Lebedь today seems to be the most popular Russian official, general, commander of 14th Army, very tough man, very blunt man, accuses those who disagree with him of being fascists, on the take, and etc. The defense minister dismissed him. Lebedь counted that he may resign from the army and run for presidency. Yeltsin reinstated him. The problem with General Lebedь is that he's a little bit like Oliver North. He sometimes has difficulty distinguishing fact and fiction. You know, he's a kind of a guy who can be elected on a local level by people who are very angry, but also people who know him and identify with him. It's a little difficult for me to envision him as a national leader. There's a very simple answer to your question: who would succeed if Yeltsin resigned or disappeared from the scene today? He would be replaced by Prime Minister Chernomyrdin. That's according to the Russian Constitution.
It's been a perfectly wonderful evening, and we're in your debt. Thank you very much.